I remember we held a horror story, spooktacular event one Halloween where we were talking about the horror stories related to Inner Source, and one community member were describing the scenario where they had,
because these are inherently promiscuous environments. I joke that software transmitted diseases are real, and that this is it's a real problem, but you can't step back and say.
And a lot of times that helps you. It does actually help you accelerate your development when you can just work in Upstream. There was
and we are collaborating, and it's quite amazing to see the caliber of engineers and people associated with this from each one of these three companies, all working together. And to the point that I made earlier, this is what open source is all about.
We are at the bleeding edge, honestly. If you look around the world at what each country's tech sector does, it's not the same as we do as a whole. And it's a really privileged position to be in.
Hello, my name is Ildiko.
And I'm Phil.
And this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is freedom.
Open source is great collaboration.
Open source is good engineering.
Open source is community.
Open source is interesting.
Open source is the future.
Open source is your opportunity to change the world around you.
Yeah, let's start recording. This sounds like fun.
In this segment, Amanda Brock shares what you can gain if you get involved in open source projects and the overall ecosystem. Is it what made you kind of decide to stay with open source because you felt that this is where you fit? I mean, you mentioned that it was a learning curve and you had to unlearn a lot of things. So was it the challenge, or was it more like it was an environment that felt like it fits?
I think there's several different things. So the first thing is that I felt like this was my tribe. And I suspect that's got a lot to do with neurodiversity, as well as the fact that there was a sort of we-orientated, community-orientated common value set. And this value set of wanting to build something that was useful, wanting to do something that was collaborative, wanting to do something that gave back. I think that for me, sort of matched my value set. And it's the same way that you look for, a partner or either a business or an emotional life partner. You're looking for somebody whose values align with you so that you're not going to drift apart and they're not going to let you down. And I feel that, and I'm going to separate this slightly, not so much the leadership of the communities, but the communities of software engineers I know around open source contribution, the actual engineers, the hands-on community, DevRel people, the folk who are at the center of that, their value set matches mine, which is why I've ended up doing what I'm doing. And then the other layer to it, I suppose, is that I'm quite nerdy in my own way. I often get told I don't look it, which amuses me, but it sort of appeals to me because it is constantly learning and it's constantly interesting, right? You're never going to know it all. Every conversation you have is deeply fascinating because other people bring new, not just knowledge, but you're on the bleeding edge, right? You're involved with the most cutting edge tech in the world. You're understanding why people do things. There isn't a day where I don't have a conversation with somebody that would be news. And we sort of experimented with this in Open UK at one point, where when we were trying to build press for the conference, every day I wrote 150, 200 words before I went to bed. And every day I wrote about something that someone had told me about, not breaching any confidentialities, but something that was interesting about my day that I would share as a story if I was talking to someone else in tech. And without exception, the UK tech press came back and either used quotes or wanted whole pieces written, not all of which I had the time to do, on those stories. And I think that
Wow.
sort of shows you, we are at the bleeding edge, honestly. If you look around the world at what each country's tech sector does, it's not the same as we do as a whole. And it's a really privileged position to be in. It's super interesting.
In this segment, Wayne Starr talks about his experience when he was 100% allocated to work on open source projects versus sharing his time between product and open source project. In your experience, you said there was a time when you were working 100% on the open source project and now your time is divided. Do you have a preference between these two, or?
I like the project side of things because it's fun to see the randomness. I think like that to me was a lot of fun. Just seeing, I don't know, it could be a student from India or like some person working in enterprise in Romania. That kind of stuff was a lot of fun to just see like the people that would come out and like interact with them and be able to work on features there. The product side is nice, but the product that I work on is the UDS software factory. So it's a lot of the same like world that I was in for 5 years in the Air Force, and so it's like, okay, I'll do this again. But it still is fun though, because we're pushing the bounds of where things could be, and we're really trying to think about how a lot of modern software development practices that have happened in the last few years can be brought back. Because I would argue, a lot of the software factories are somewhere circa 2018, 2019, which is new. It's relatively new for the government, but there has been a lot of stuff that's happened in the last 5 years, even for as fast as technology moves. And so being able to take some of those new things, taking stuff like SigStore and then Toto and talking about attestations, that stuff hasn't really made its way into the DoD fully yet. And so we can really still do a lot there and still push the ball forward for that.
Yeah, I think things are going to be moving faster still, right? I mean, particularly in the area of security. So staying current is not easy and very beneficial.
Right.
To understand a little better your kind of daily life at work, like for instance, when you were 100% working on Zarf, the open source project, did you still get like guidance or sort of requests from the product side in terms of what you should work on, or was your job description to maintain the project, whatever makes the most sense for the project?
It was basically to maintain the project. So we had a unified backlog in GitHub. Everything went into a GitHub issue. So whether somebody messaged me in our internal Slack or in the K8 Slack, the answer was put it in a GitHub issue, and then we'll prioritize it and get to it.
Good policy.
And so yeah, so that was a lot of how we dealt with certain things. Obviously, especially earlier on, a lot more of the requests, because more of the users were internal to the company, were around the company's priorities there. So. But there was a lot of stuff that we did do with and for the community, and it was cool to see, even some large features like Danny Gershman, who's one of the maintainers now from another company on Zarf called Radius Method. He implemented like the Argo CD support, which is not something any of our customers at all use, but it's something that was really cool to be able to see come into Zarf and helps build that community around the product.
And I will wager there will be some point in the not so distant future where your customers will want that as well.
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Was there ever a pushback on the product side that like you're maintaining something that your customers don't need and why you have to spend your time there? Or was it always understood from your management as well as the customer pressures that it's something that you just need to do, and it's okay if someone contributes something that you just currently don't have a use of?
Yeah, the Defense Unicorns started as an open source company, and it is core to its ethos. So there wasn't really much pushback from at least our side of things, because it was kind of expected. And a lot of times that helps you. It does actually help you accelerate your development when you can just work in Upstream. There was some, part of Zarf uses like Git as a Git server, and some folks were wanting to use it as a package registry as well. Some of it's like Python and npm registries. And there were some issues there earlier on that we were having, and it was just like, yes, okay, we could maybe make a wrapper around this or do our own project, but like it's faster if we just go to Git and open some PRs and then make that product better and then take the next version. And that's largely how we do things, even on the software factory side, where we're integrating something like SonarQube. If there's an issue with their Helm chart, like one of the folks on my team, he just had one of his PRs get released because there was an issue with some of the arguments that were passed to the container on the deployment in the Helm chart, and we needed to correct that for some of the stuff that we were doing. And so we just made a PR, fixed the problem, and then they released it. And it's a lot easier to do that than to try to fork the Helm chart and then try to do your own thing. And then like it just go with the flow, work with Upstream, and then you'll be faster in the end. Even if you have to wait like a few weeks in between, like you probably have enough work to do in the meantime, and you can move on to other things. So yeah.
Nice. And since you're now working on both product and the open source project, have you had any conflict about this, or so far the ratio between open source and product work is still something that you're good with?
I think I'm pretty much good with it for the most part. I mean, my sort of from a software dev hat perspective, my heart is in the open source side because I really do like that work and just seeing the cool tech side of things. But from the mission impact side, I also know how important the product development is, and what impacts it can have. One of the moments I still remember kind of vividly was when we actually deployed the Tanker Planner tool to production. And we were sitting there in Qatar with the tanker planners having a cigar in the middle of the desert at night, and like just talking with them and seeing the smiles on their faces and the impact that it had to them. That really has an impact on you, and that's really like also really special. And so I think there's enough special stuff in both sides that I can enjoy that both.
Can you tell if there's like a fixed percentage of time that goes into like the open source project, or does it always vary how much you spend on each side?
It varies. For the most part, it's kind of down to the vision and direction. Because I'm on that UDS Software Factory product at this point. Most of my time is spent on the product side at this point, but it does significantly vary because if we're having something that we want to propose or introduce to Zarf, then I'm going to be spending a lot of time with Zarf. Or Pepper or Lula, because we're using those as the core of a lot of the stuff that we're doing too. So it does vary from week to week, and sometimes it's not even our own products; it's some other thing like SonarQube, like I mentioned, where okay, let's contribute to them and do these things. So I would say it's probably maybe 80% product, 20% project at this point, but that's there. And all of the stuff we make is still Apache 2, so it still is open source. It's just we're not trying to build a community around it quite yet, just to help focus the products.
Right, and I mean, it sounds like Defense Unicorns, you're as much of a services company as a product company, right? Where you're selling a specific activity, a specific service, where you're leveraging what you've productified and what you're fully able to support. But it's more of a services business, it sounds like, as opposed to a straight product business.
Yeah, it's a bit of both. We started as a very services oriented business. So pretty much when we started, we really had Zarf. That was it. And then really was just selling services around Zarf and kind of like different ways we could do that. As we've grown and as we've kind of explored certain things, we've added more open source projects, and then we've sort of solidified what it means to productize these things. And so I would say we were a services company. We're somewhere in the middle now, and we're trying to move further and further into the product side of things, so that ideally people can pick up more of what we do and just use it. We can be a little bit more hands off on those things. So a lot of what I'm doing with like the UDS Software Factory side of things is taking products like GitLab and then building a robust Zarf package around them that has integrations with other technologies like Pepper for doing some policies and some of the other things we've built into UDS, like Keycloak integrations and Grafana and Loki, logging and monitoring, new vector, and all of those things to build a secure platform. And the idea is eventually to build this into something that people can just take and compose and deploy without needing to have a whole bunch of how everything works together. And because it was built from the air gap to begin with, like it'll work anywhere.
Cool.
In terms of people who you're working with within Defense Unicorns, is the setup kind of how you were, like either 100% working on one of the open source projects, or like more product versus open source, or different team members have different ratios between their allocation to product versus project, if you know?
Yeah, different teams will have different things. So there's like a dedicated team around Zarf, and that team is going to be 100% on Zarf. And then different teams will have different things that they wind up doing. I think it's probably the 80-20 thing is probably about right for most UDS teams. So I'm one of a couple of UDS teams on that side. But then Zarf, Pepper, Lula, they just work on their projects. And same thing with Leapfrog. And so they're just mostly focused on like, how do we build a community? How do we do these things? How do we work towards donation? What do we need to do that? Where are we targeting to go for all those things? Because all of those kinds of projects are the ones that we're actually targeting to donate to foundations, and that we do want to have these communities around. And there is a lot of benefit from that, because like with Zarf, like Radius Method is able to take that, and they're now a maintainer, but they're able to take that and build some of their own business around this thing. And having it in a foundation allows there to be a broader community, not just with like the random individuals, but also like with other fellow DoD contractors, because they also work in the same software factory space. And so that kind of helps to build some of a coalition and adoption within our own space, and also goes back to some of what I was mentioning before, where it would be nice if more DoD contractors actually adopted open source and got involved, because it could open up this huge market effectively to adoption there. So that's some of what we're driving and trying to push towards. But you need to have an open source community, and you need to have it donated for other people to trust you, because otherwise you could do a HashiCorp and or
neutral
whatever.
home. A neutral home is helpful.
Yes.
In this segment, Clare Dillon shares an example of how budget allocations can negatively affect the ability to encourage collaboration between teams within bigger companies. Yeah, the other prime example I think is management, especially on the middle layer, where they have the pressure from both bottom and up.
Right.
Because they are the ones who are being hammered, because there are customers, there are deadlines, there's the product that has to go out the door, and then they also have all the complaints and frustration of the developers and people who are actually creating that product. And at least I only have experience in trying to help an organization to at least consider an open source transformation. And on that middle layer management level, it's just sometimes the whole thing is just dismissed. Like, yeah, I understand, cool idea. We don't have time for that. We don't have this and that for that. And they are just kind of with ignorance pushing the whole direction into that, running down the road where our product will become unmaintainable at one point. But because of all the short-term goals, it's just something that never becomes a priority. Is it any easier with inner source?
No. I mean, like the poor middle managers, they get awful bad rep, and like I feel for them, because it is exactly that. I love the way you describe that. As I mean, they're stuck in the middle. Like they're getting these sometimes unrealistic expectations from the top, and they're getting kind of personal opinions from the bottom. I remember we held a kind of a horror story, spooktacular event one Halloween where we were talking about the horror stories related to InnerSource. And one community member were describing this scenario where they had in their organization, they had two teams who were sitting next to each other, but they both were parts of different departments. And they both had been allocated resources to build essentially the same thing, right? Like pretty much the same thing. And they were sitting right beside each other, like in the office. So they kind of went to their management and went, we're both being paid to do exactly the same thing. And we're not talking about small groups, right? We're talking about big groups of, like, it wasn't like two individuals. It was big groups that had been budgeted to build the same thing. And separately. And they went to their individual managers and they went, we want to collaborate. Why don't we all work together and we'll either do it in half the time or we'll build it twice as good or whatever it is. But we have, we're going to work together to build the same thing, have better sustainability. And they figured this out beforehand. And they went to their management and the management went, no, because we've already put in the budget justification. If we don't spend this budget, we won't get it next year. So you're just going to have to build the two things simultaneously. That's what you're going to do. And I remember everyone going, oh, the middle management. and at the same time, that's the truth. That's like, if it's not that they both would have, the next time round, someone somewhere will be like, well, if there's two teams doing that, we'll just get rid of one of them. Because someone with a spreadsheet somewhere will do that. And sometimes that's not acceptable. So, I mean, it's possibly the most efficient choice, but you'd like to think that it would involve those two teams building something better or being redeployed. And maybe that would happen, but that takes too long within the organizational constraints that sometimes exist. So realistically, perhaps the best thing to do is to collaborate as you go and figure out how you could merge it later and make that argument for the next round of budgeting. But perhaps, even though it rationally doesn't make sense, perhaps that was a necessary thing for that organization to, I suppose, evolve. I don't know. I'd like to think so. But it's a cautionary tale about how what's sensible doesn't always, again, no matter how sensible and rational things are, they don't always win. And so it's really about kind of thinking about the context of these sort of things. So yes, still a problem. Wish it was easier. But I do think back to that previous conversation about the kinds of value that people kind of appreciate. There's definitely momentum in management in organizations that are moving towards, like they're starting to have more goals that are moving towards aligning with open source goals and InnerSource goals, like the idea of having something that's more sustainable, like the idea of creating more dynamic workforces that can move from here to there and work remotely and are connected in the ecosystem and are outside in, knowledge and learning quickly from each other through transparency in general, because that's all good for trust and all of these things that are, and productivity and how you do things faster and even things like developer satisfaction. So all of these concepts, perhaps they weren't in management discussions. Like, a few years ago, it was kind of like, move fast, break things, burn them out early. Like, I mean, that was perfectly fine. It was kind of like there's more where they came from. I don't think they were saying that, but that was kind of the vibe. Whereas now these days, sustainability, burnout of individuals, how do you maintain, growth mindset, all of these things are aligning more with InnerSource and open source. So one would hope middle management begins to align more with the benefits too.
In this segment, Stephen Walli talks about the challenges in securing the software supply chain in the open source ecosystem and some of the ways how the communities are approaching to solve them.
So how do you see this evolving? Because this is a very topical conversation, right?
Absolutely.
Because I'm pretty sure the vast majority of the planet had never heard of XZ until just a couple of weeks ago.
Until 2 weeks ago, yeah. Well,
so I mean, so how do you identify what's necessary to curate out of those 200 million repos? So that, what are those 90,000? And is it 90? Because you're still, even if you look at Debian,
like the numbers so a really interesting exercise. There was a really interesting discussion that I was party to inside of Microsoft a few years ago. And it's like on the one kind of extreme end, you have, no, there's 80,000, no, 85, maybe 90,000 packages. Like there's tens of thousands of packages, close to 100,000 packages in the Debian world that has this self-organizing, self-certifying set of engineers that keep it afloat, which is pretty amazing when you stop and think about it. But on the other end of the spectrum, there was, I think it was Alpine Linux at the time. So, you know, the lovely little container Linux that that was that about 7, 8 years ago, they kind of showed up. They had 300 packages.
Yep.
And that was their narrow, and for them, this was here are the 300 packages that as a Linux kernel distro project, these are the 300 we needed. And we think we can build everything else from this 300. Okay, that's another interesting endpoint. And I'm not saying they had the right 300. They had the right 300 for them. And so between those two endpoints, there's a set of packages. And that's, again, where I think folks have to be good software engineers and thoughtful about the problem. It's like, you know, do you just casually start reaching into these buckets and don't think twice about it? That's dangerous. Some of these things I think get broken down by language community. When you look at the software engineering practices in the Python community broadly, user community, versus the JavaScript user community broadly, you see a very different style of development for the software than you do when you look at C or C++ engineers or Go engineers or C# engineers over the last 25, 30 years. And again, it was because of where that software came from and the culture of it. So, you know, in the Python community, there's a lot easier attack vectors that folks have demonstrated over the last decade. Same in the JavaScript node community, because these are inherently promiscuous environments. You know, I joke that, you know, software transmitted diseases are real, and this is you know, it's a real problem, but you can't step back and say somehow all of those people need to stop doing what they're doing and do it differently. That's why I think so. There's one project going on within the Linux Foundation right now. It's adjacent, came out of the work of the OpenSSF. The project's called Alpha Omega. And while all of these companies collectively struggle with this, how are we going to secure the software supply chain? Microsoft, Amazon, and Google set up a bucket of money. And there's 3 competent, security-minded software engineers, one from each company, that are basically, they act as a grant organization. So each of the companies throws a couple of $1 million a year into the bucket, and these 3 security-minded, deeply experienced software engineers are accepting grant requests from all of these different language or collective groups of folks in the open source broad community. And I think the work they have kind of this constant success rate for the alpha grants that they've been making. If you look at the money that they gave to the Eclipse Foundation as a fairly mature foundation, the Eclipse Foundation turned around and built a security team that they're now using to do a deep dive across their entire portfolio of projects, working with the projects, working with the infrastructure, figuring out how do we improve our security posture. PyPI, I think it was PyPI hired a security expert in residence to start to work across their community. And that's not the Python Foundation, that was just for PyPI. And, you know, there was a direct grant to the Rust Foundation, again. And I think the joy of this is, instead of saying, we have an industry-wide problem and we're going to figure out a solution, Alpha Omega is sitting there realizing that maybe if we gave grants to each of the different constituencies, they could do something that was culturally appropriate in that constituency to improve their security posture. And I think that's the way we get there, is this kind of constant get better. There isn't a solution, but we can constantly get better. One of the things that, again, that social engineering in Debian that always fascinates me. There's an engineer named Chris Lamb who came up with the whole reproducible builds work 10 years ago. And he came up with it earlier than that. The Debian community went, not really interested. But 10 years ago, they suddenly got interested in it. And so he, released the initial tool set. They regularly release the tools. And what they're encouraging is that all the Debian packages are reproducibly built. And that means the three of us could each do the build on our own build environments and come up with something that is checksum clean between us. And this is kind of a fascinating idea when you start thinking about how do we secure the planet, is instead of saying, well, we need universal identity, but that's never going to work. Or, we need to come up with a set of tools. That's never going to work. Not across all of these diverse communities. The idea, no, we'll come up with an AI because that'll solve all of our problems. Did I get enough sarcasm in my voice there? The thing they've created, though, is a set of tools where they kept improving the tools, turning up the warning level, improving the tools, turning up the warning level. And at this point, 10 years later, something like 95% of those 90,000 packages are reproducibly built on a regular basis. And lots of other developer communities in the broad open source world have been trying to figure out how to do the same thing using the tools and improving the tool sets. So, the Maven community is struggling with this and the rest of it. But the intent in the discussions that I was party to, pre-COVID, so let's roll it back 5 years, was if we can get to that point that all, whatever all means, the packages can be reproducibly built, then you're in a situation where the three big hyperscalers, for their own internal use and maybe the use of their customers, have a set of packages. Are they identical as a set? No, but they probably overlap a lot. Pick 5 universities in 3 countries that are huge research universities that might, well, again, anchor a set of packages built. And yet the idea that, I'm a small Midwestern university, I'm just going to point at the CMU repository. That's my first place that I'm going to download things from. And, again, pick 3 government agencies in the US and 2 in the EU. And, so all of us end up in this place where it doesn't matter what you think of yourself as a university research environment or a corporate environment or a state actor environment. We've got these repos of rebuilt software where we could have a tool that any of the 3 of us could say, I always go here first, and I check the checksums with these next 3 in line. And it doesn't matter if one of the 3 in line doesn't have my package, as long as I get 2 confirming checksums. So it doesn't mean that we all have to rebuild the same software all the time.
Right.
We can all be incredibly selfish in the things that we consider to rebuild for our constituents of researchers or government agencies or whatever. But so what all this means, though, is as a system, when you look at it at that systemic level, you're looking at a system where it didn't require a whole lot of folks to do a whole lot of things the same way, but we can catch bad behavior or mistakes quickly. You could even have the tool gently, okay, I was checking 3 checksums and I found one that just does not line up. The tool itself could be the thing that notifies that repo on its standardized list of, hey, found a checksum that's busted. And give it in a fairly rich detail of, it doesn't line up with these other two places. You could even be a hostile government that creates a repo of suspect trashed code for your own citizens to use, but you still have the ability to check that it was correct before you hacked it, kind of thing, right? Not picking on any nations, but some nations are very intrusive into their civilians' lives, kind of thing, and might require you have to pull your software from this repo that we built. They still have that reliable check back through the system of, well, at least it was correct when it got to us. It only has our hack in it now. It's these kinds of systems that kind of system design that I find fascinating.
Yeah,
and I
think we're going to need to move to something like that.
Place we get to over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I think we'll need to.
Yeah, and it doesn't require all of us to do the identical thing at the identical time.
In this segment, Gregory Kurtzer introduces OpenELA, which stands for Open Enterprise Linux Association.
We haven't talked about OpenELA yet. OpenELA is a trade association between CIQ, Oracle, and SUSE, really focused on making sure that the source code for enterprise Linux is always publicly accessible to everybody, and that we all can go and build downstream derivatives of enterprise Linux while maintaining compatibility. We can add value if we want. So one of the things that I've been pitching quite a bit is I really want to have an enterprise Linux kernel that is collaboratively maintained using something much more similar to the Android kernel module. And this is something that Greg Crow Hartman and I have spoken about a few times, that there's a real opportunity here to, I think, do something that is much better than what the status quo is. So when we talk about operating system, and this again ties back into your question about operating system maintenance and whatnot, I see that is probably the best way that we can be handling the kernel moving forward. Now, it will require resetting of some expectations and some alignment from some of the primary vendors in the ecosystem. I would love to see that alignment and that collaboration happening in an open forum, such that we can all be part of this, not being locked behind a single vendor door.
What was the name of that organization that has just been formed?
Oh, OpenELA. It stands for the Open Enterprise Linux Association. And it is a 501c6 trade association that today is responsible for just making sure that, this is funny to even say, but to make sure that open source software is freely available. So we
may think it's funny to say, but it's not.
Yes. So it basically is making sure that for example, anybody can go and grab enterprise Linux sources and go build an operating system based on that. The goal of that, again, some operating systems add value, like Oracle. They actually have a number of different changes to enterprise Linux, such that it can provide a substrate to their database and other corporate utilities that Oracle pushes and provides. So they have various optimizations in there and whatnot, and they track a much newer kernel. But part of that is because they can't track the Red Hat kernel very much anymore, because the other thing that has happened is the Upstream enterprise Linux kernel has no longer is providing patches or Git history or context on what is being changed. It's a black box it's a tarball that just has an export of the current status with no patches. Considering how big the kernel is, it's very difficult to debug what's going on and to make changes to the app. So Oracle has decided that they're going to run with their own kernel that, again, is based on something closer to Upstream. So we're seeing this happen. We're seeing some of this happen. And I do believe that is the future. It has to be the future, in my opinion, for enterprise Linux. And I'm hoping that OpenELA will provide to be a good home for how do we all collaborate. And as I said, we already have SUSE, Oracle, and my company CIQ involved in this, and we are collaborating. And it's quite amazing to see the caliber of engineers and people associated with this from each one of these three companies, all working together. And to the point that I made earlier, this is what open source is all about. Having competitors come together and solve problems where we can now all build value on top of that in our own special ways. Like the value of CIQ is different than the value of SUSE. And as a result, we have got a fantastic relationship with SUSE. We have a fantastic relationship with Oracle because of this.
To your comment about, making sure that open source software remains openly available, the Open Infra Foundation has this exact thing as one of the primary goals. We articulate that all the time, and especially more recently as changes happen in the ecosystem, and not necessarily changes, but events happen in the ecosystem that are not really friendly to this mission and goal to really preserve the open source ecosystem and the projects and all the values that it brings to individuals as well as organizations, companies, anyone who's participating. We very often just throw out the numbers that 80% of all the code is open source, relying on open source. If you're using any kind of modern tool that runs software, that will have open source components to it and open source code in it. So it's not like it's going away, like it is there. It is fundamentally part of our lives. So it really is on us to figure out how to sustain this ecosystem, and it's a sad thing to say that we have to have that as an articulated goal, and it's not something that's just self-explanatory. That it is something that is a value and goal for everybody.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. This conversation is reminding me. I had a GM, a pickup truck, and it had an infotainment system on it. And not every time that I turn on the car, but every now and then, it would actually have a splash screen. And in that splash screen, it would say something along the lines of, this infotainment system uses open source software. For more information and to download it, go to this URL. That is so far above and beyond, I think, what they had to do there. But I love it. I really love how they embrace the fact that there is open source software in here. And it's possible their legal team told them to do it to mitigate some of the license risks and the legal risks. But I don't see many other infotainment systems in cars doing that. So I think it was a really nice move of GM to do that. And I think I'm 99% sure it was either my GM or my Dodge. I don't remember which. It was one of those two. But and I remember seeing it, and I remember at some point thinking I should take a picture of it, and then I sold the car. So I never got a picture of it, but I like cars, so I go through cars.
I think this is pretty cool. It literally gave me chills.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. We already have a lot of great content lined up for Season 2. We will talk about inner source, or in other words, why and how companies are using open source methodologies internally. We will talk about why and how governments are using open source and touch on upcoming legislations such as the Cyber Resiliency Act in Europe. We will also discuss how to create open source projects and communities that last for decades. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
Wouldn't you wish there was a silver bullet, but no, silver budget as well. Silver budget that is
that's
a silver
what you
bullet.
need is a silver. Exactly.
That's it. And to be fair, some people.
So I bought some bidets. This should have been a very simple project. This should be simple. What bidet do you want? You install the bidet and you sit down and you enjoy the bidet. That's it, simple. But I bought the best bidet. And you know how engineers go. Nothing simple.
But we just had a good time just talking and whatnot. And by the end of it, he figured out I played pretty quick. So by the end of it, he actually made me play with him. And so I played music with Kix Brooks. That was fun.
Way cool. That's a great story.
He is waiting for me to finish this podcast so that I don't know if you